You're gonna do it? Okay. All right.
Good morning and welcome to the second Samuel. And we're going to watch this video. I'm going to share my screen and I'll do a quick test to make sure that you all can hear it in person and see it too. 1 second. Can you see the screen at in the office?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. How about now?
Okay.
Even
Yeah.
better? Great.
The book of 2 Samuel. Check out the video on 1 Samuel where we were introduced to the book's three main characters, Samuel, Saul, and David, and then also to the book's literary design, which first introduced Samuel and then traced the rise and fall of King Saul in contrast to the rise of King David. 2 Samuel tells the story of David as Israel's king, and in two movements. There's a season of success and of blessing, followed by a huge moral failure and then its sad consequences. And then the book ends with this well-crafted conclusion that reflects back on the good and the bad in David's life, generating hope for a future king to come from his line. So 2 Samuel picks up after Saul's death, and David surprises everyone by composing this long poem where he laments the death of the very man who tried to murder him. And so once again, the author, he's presenting David's humility and compassion. He's a man who grieves the death even of his own enemies. After this, David experiences a season of success and God's blessing. All of the Israelite tribes, they come to David and then they ask him to unify all the tribes as their king. And so the first thing David does as king is to go to the city of Jerusalem. He conquers it, and he establishes it as Israel's capital city, which he renames as Zion. And from there, David goes on and he wins many battles and expands Israel's territory. Now, after making Jerusalem the political capital of Israel, he wants to make it their religious capital as well. And so he has the Ark of the Covenant moved into the city. And then in 2 Samuel 7, he tells God, now that Israel has a permanent home, he thinks that God's presence should also get a permanent house. So he asks if he can build a temple for the God of Israel. But God says to David, thank you for that thought, but actually I'm going to build you a house, a dynasty. Now, 2 Samuel 7, this is a key chapter for understanding the storyline of the whole Bible, because God here makes a promise to David that from his royal line will come a future king who's going to build God's temple here on earth and set up an eternal kingdom. And it's this messianic promise to David that gets picked up and developed more in the book of Psalms and also in the books of the prophets. And it's this king that gets connected to God's promise to Abraham. The future messianic kingdom will be how God brings his blessing to all of the nations. And it's right here, in the midst of all this divine blessing, that things go horribly wrong. David makes a fatal mistake. Not fatal for him, but for a man named Uriah, one of David's prize soldiers. So from his rooftop, David sees Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, bathing. David finds her, he sleeps with her, gets her pregnant, and then he tries to cover the whole thing up by having Uriah assassinated and then marrying her. It's just horrible. So when David's confronted by the prophet Nathan about all of this, he immediately owns up to what he's done. He's broken, he repents, he asks God to forgive him, and God does forgive him, but God doesn't erase the consequences of David's decisions. And so as a result of this horrible choice, David's family, his kingdom, it all falls apart. And it makes this section a tragic story, much like Saul's downfall. So David's sons end up repeating his own mistakes, but in even more tragic ways. So Amnon sexually abuses his sister Tamar, and then their brother Absalom finds out about all of this and has Amnon assassinated. And then Absalom goes and he hatches the secret plan to oust his father David from power, and he launches this full-scale rebellion. And so for a second time, David is forced to flee from his own home and go hide in the wilderness, except this time he is not an innocent man. The rebellion ends when David's son is murdered, when it breaks David's heart. And so once again, he laments over the very man who tried to kill him. David's last days find him back on his throne, but as a broken man, he's wounded by the sad consequences of his sin. The book concludes with a well-crafted epilogue, with stories that are out of chronological order, but they have this really cool symmetrical literary design. So the outer pair of stories come from earlier in David's reign, and they compare the failures of Saul and then of David, and how each of them hurt other people through their bad decisions. The next inner pair of stories are about David and his band of mighty men who went about fighting the Philistines. And what's interesting is that both sections have a story of David's weakness in battle. So in contrast to the victorious David of chapters 1 through 9, here we see a vulnerable David who's dependent on others for help. The center of the epilogue has 2 poems that act like memoirs, and David reflects back on his life, and he remembers times when God graciously rescued him from danger. And he sees these as moments where God was faithful to his covenant promise to him and to his family. Both poems conclude by looking back onto the hope of God's promise of a future king who will build that eternal kingdom. Now these poems and then God's promise also connect back to Hannah's poem that opened the book. And so these key passages from the beginning, now the middle, and the end of the book bring the book's themes all together. Despite Saul and David's evil, God remained at work, moving forward his redemptive purposes. And God opposed David and Saul's arrogance, but he exalted David when he humbled himself. And so the future hope of this book reaches far beyond David himself. It looks to the future, to the Messianic king who will one day bring God's kingdom and blessing to all of the nations. And that's what the book of Samuel is all about.
Great.
I love that.
But I
That's a great summary.
What I thought was interesting is that Bathsheba's child is the one who becomes the king, rather than somebody else. It was Bathsheba who was the one which he sinned with, and it's just different. I mean, surprising.
Unexpected. Exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, there's a lot of hope in that Bathsheba, for example, the story of Tamar, which comes after that, and her rape from her brother, that she's kind of relegated to the background and kind of ostracized, and that's happened before in scripture for women, but not Bathsheba. She transforms the situation she's in into kind of becoming effectively the queen mother, if you will, to kind of help raise a child who's going to be the heir. It's something really poetic about that. Great observation. Other things maybe that you heard or in that video or reacted to? Hopefully it helps when we're mired in the details of warfare and stuff to kind of hear an overall message of hope in there.
Well, the other thing I noticed too, and since nobody else was answering, so anyway, I just thought that when David humbled himself, God then brought him back up and became forgiven for what he'd done.
That's right.
So, and God continued to use him and honor his dynasty.
And the other thing is, it's taking a bird's eye view look at all of this. You see that there's this conversation kind of happening in scripture between books, that kind of dialogue, where the early ancient Hebrews thought God punished and God hardened Pharaoh's heart, things like that. But in this one, while that's still there and part of their tradition, there's this working through of a process of maybe almost like karma, that maybe what David has done, the poor decisions, for the worst decision being Bathsheba, according to this narrator, that bad decision sets off a series of terrible things happening to other people as well in the subsequent chapters, namely Tamar and then Absalom. And I just think that's a nice example of the Bible it's kind of sitting with that tension a little bit of, did God cause punishment or did humans bring their own punishment upon themselves? I think that's something we still wrestle with today, you know.
I
Okay.
just find it amazing in terms of the parallels between Saul and David.
Yeah.
It just became so clear when he did that overview that was like, oh my gosh, there really are a lot of similarities between the two.
Exactly. And and you know that it's it was probably there already in the whatever the history, the real David and Saul was a little bit. Certainly that sense from the people that there was kind of this major echo, that you know they choose a king. Remember, the whole thing began in First Samuel with Israel saying, we don't want prophets anymore, we want a king. You know, we don't want judges anymore, we want kings, like a king like all the other tribes have. You know, we're jealous of the Philistines and all these other ones. We want a king who makes decisions. And God's like, be careful what you wish for, because kings are very, very human. And then we go right into Saul and his tragic fall, and it ends in his death on the battlefield. And now we have David, and we're about to read about David's death, which will not be on the battlefield, but you know, his life comes with some great tragedy as a result of his own failings. Yeah.
Well, the one other thing too I noticed is when David asked to build the temple and God said no. I just thought that was like, wow. I mean, you know, because sometimes, you know, you pray for something and maybe you're praying for something that you want, but it's not really, maybe not the right timing or the right thing or whatever, and God seems to say no or wait or whatever. I don't know how prayer works sometimes, but all I would say is that, you know, in the way he explained it on the screen there, and God said no, I go, oh.
Yeah.
I thought that the reason David was told he couldn't do it was because he was a warrior with blood on his hands.
Yes, that's true. You don't see it in 2 Samuel, but you do see it in Kings.
Mm. Which is where this goes next.
I don't remember which Kings, but yeah, that's I saw it before. I think it may be 2 Kings, but anyway, yeah, that's true, Don. But yeah, that's additional information from a different source. So yeah.
And just to give a brief little recap of what we were reading last week, chapter 21, 22, and that summary on Bible Project just did, touched on, with that they kind of, if you will, a little epilogue here of these last 4 chapters that include a retelling of, you know, a broad swath of what we've already read, but almost from a different perspective and a different tradition. It probably was that got inserted in, and that's how the Bible deals with inconsistencies. It just lays them out there. They don't edit or say this one's the right one or not. They just let multiple communities have their say in the storytelling here. So that's why you get a little bit of I think the video said the chronology is not the same. Anyway, so now we're on chapter 23, and I'm going to volunteer myself to read the second half because it's got a bunch of big names, and I'm going to do that for you because I love you dearly. And would someone else like to read the first half? I'm thinking chapter 23, verse 1 to maybe 1 to 17.
I can do that if you want.
Great, thanks, Leslie.
And I'm reading out of the NRSV.
Awesome.
Now these are the last words of David, the oracle of David, son of Jesse, the oracle of the man whom God exalted, the anointed of the God of Jacob, the favorite of the strong one of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord speaks through me. His word is upon my tongue. The God of Israel has spoken. The Rock of Israel has said to me, one who rules over people justly, ruling in the fear of God. It's like the light of the morning, like the sun rising on a cloudless morning, gleaming from the rain on the grassy land. It is not my house like this with God. Oh, excuse me. It's not my house like this with God, for he has made with me for an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. Will he not cause to prosper all my help and my desire? But the godless are all like thorns that are thrown away, for they cannot be picked up with the hand. To touch them, one uses an iron bar or the shaft of a spear, and they are entirely consumed in fire on the spot. These are the names of the warriors whom David had. Josheb Bashebeth, a Tarchamonite. He was chief of the three. He wielded a spear against 800 whom he killed at one time. Next to him among the three warriors was Eleazar, son of Dodo, son of Ahoy. He was with David when they defied the Philistines who were gathered there for battle. The Israelites withdrew, but he stood his ground. He struck down the Philistines until his arm grew weary, though his hand clung to the sword. The Lord brought about a great victory that day. Then the people came back to him, but only to strip the dead. Next to him was Shammah, son of Agi, the Hararite. The Philistines gathered together at Lehi, where there was a plot of ground full of lentils, and the army fled from the Philistines. But he took his stand in the middle of the plot, defended it, and killed the Philistines, and the Lord brought about a great victory. Towards the beginning of harvest, 3 of the 30 chiefs went down to join David at the cave of Adullam, while a band of Philistines was encamped in the valley of Rephaim. David was then in the stronghold, and the garrison of the Philistines was then at Bethlehem. David said longingly, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem, that is by the gate." Then the 3 warriors broke through the camp of the Philistines, drew water from the well of Bethlehem, that was by the gate, and brought it to David. But he would not drink of it. He poured it out to the Lord, for he said, "Lord, forbid that I should do this. Can I drink the blood of the men who went at the risk of their lives?" Therefore he would not drink it. The 3 warriors did these things.
So you get this kind of idea of well, there's a lot going on here. Let me just work backwards. But the 3 warriors, my footnote says nothing more is known about these 3 in David's army. You know, this is just kind of a revisit or a look back over just kind of the military strengths or accomplishments of David, you know, via his general. It's almost like you're kind of walking through a kind of a gallery, and you're seeing these kind of portraits or busts of these great figures that were central to David's life, you know, kind of in a like a send-off of David from the narrative in some ways. And that kind of leads back to the first point, which is, you know, this poem here, and hopefully your translations that you're looking at have them set in verse form, like poetry, verses 1 to 7. You know, that's clearly a poem, much like Hannah's song, much like the other song from Psalm 1, from Samuel 1, which was, you know, Saul's men. What's the one? I almost have it memorized now. Saul's men, you know, had victory over 100, but David's men had victory over 1,000. You know, it was like a song that they were all singing, and they were kind of retrofitting that back into the narrative a little bit. Similarly here, a really, really beautiful, at least in English, a beautiful poem that are called The Last Words of David, but really are a song about his accomplishments, not necessarily his deathbed confession. Let's put it that way. Would that we all were so poetic on our deathbeds, you know. What else? What else do you notice or take away?
I'm not sure how anybody can kill 800 men at one time.
You think they might be embellishing a little bit?
I think so.
Yeah, it's like, oh, they were rippling muscles. They were 8 feet tall.
And it
Or
was
like
all
in
by himself.
Genesis, they were 100 years old and then they were pregnant.
It was
Yeah.
all by himself because the rest had abandoned him. So he was standing there by himself with a tired hand. And yeah, so
There's a lot of, great names in here, none of which really caught on except David over time. The one that always cracks me up is Dodo. It's funny that name never caught on as a name.
So is this section that I just read, was that pretty much just kind of retelling some of the stuff that happened earlier on in Second Samuel? Or is it real?
Yes, and also some things that we didn't encounter. Little stories that are just kind of like, part of the mythos of David. This is a really fascinating window into history starting to become a thing. We're a little bit pre the height of Greco-Roman culture, where you had historians actually using history and biography as an art, which then led into the Gospels, which are not a history or biography, but definitely owe themselves to that. But prior to that, it's a spoken oral culture that's switching into a written culture, mostly for worship, but eventually into history. So all of that preamble, which I've probably talked about ad nauseum, is just to mean that it's hard to decipher what's myth and what is historical fact, but that David's life is kind of syncing up with the time where we can actually record some history, some pinpoint, some actual facts. But as to what those are in the story, it's hard to say. That doesn't mean it's not still scripture. It just means did David really sling the Goliath with a slingshot, or was David more just a classic warrior that just kind of rose up amongst his soldiers? Who knows?
especially if you look at this as being written not at the time of David, but being written at the time of the exile. So it's one thing that sticks out to me in this passage is David's greatness, and the greatness of the three and the others yet to come is all based on massacring people,
Right.
killing people. Yeah,
That's their measure of success. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And it seems that's kind of turned on its head in the New Testament. But anyway, so
That's right. That's right.
Thing that stood out to me, and like I said, my version is different, but verse 3, the God of Israel said, the Rock of Israel spoke to me. He who rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God.
Yeah.
So that in the fear was a chosen phrase, not in the love, in honor, in likeness, in fear was the chosen word. And growing up with Catholic guilt, yes, you should fear. But fear means we're afraid of his punishment, not honoring, not in his greatness, not in fear was a chosen word, and that one word can change that whole meaning.
Right. Exactly.
well, that word can also be used in terms of not quaking in fear, but also can refer to reverence. It's Hebrew word yirah, and it can mean both fear and it also can be reverence. So I think we'd have to look at that carefully to say that fear is used contemporarily. There are other connotations for that too as well. Yeah.
David, I remembered reading something about that several years ago, And the fact that in many cases, biblical scholars feel like awe or reverence is actually a closer translation of what the writers meant at the time.
Yeah.
Um,
In fact,
because when.
no,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that if the word is interpreted as fear, then that kind of cascades into all of the shame and guilt and blah 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 that you started referring to,
Right.
which casts God in a certain light, as opposed to a God who one just is awestruck by or is revered. It's a totally different construct, really.
Right. Saying reverence, fear meaning reverence, changes
Yeah.
all of it,
Yes.
right?
Right.
Yep.
And
We've
I like that.
we've
thought.
mentioned before that these Hebrew words have multiple meanings. So the word David was talking about, this is a great resource, by the way, which I can only do from when I'm at my home computer, the Blue Letter Bible, and you can drill down on these words if that's your thing. Might just be David and I. But Yirah, so you read right to left, Yirah, pronounced Yirah, and its first meaning is fear, terror, or fearing, but as we were just saying, here's another version: fear of God, respect, reverence, or piety. Awe as well. So that's probably what the intention was. But you know, if you think about it, if you're in awe of God, you might be a little afraid too of something that's bigger and powerful than you. But it doesn't mean you're afraid of necessarily a punishment, but you're afraid because of a reverence of a you know, you're in the presence of the Almighty, which is really interesting word.
Of course, we're looking at this from our understanding of how Jesus represented God. And at the time, culturally, most people did fear their gods. They were that's why they sacrificed to placate their gods when they did something wrong. So understanding this in the terms of actually being afraid is probably in the culture. From which this comes, that was a very a very good understanding of how many people felt about their gods.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like I wonder if too, if the listener in the temple hearing the scroll, you know, the reason they use a word like that is that you have two people. It's like being on the edge of a cliff. You say you've hiked a mountain, and two of you look out, and one of them gets to the edge and goes, "Isn't it fantastic?" And then the other one goes, "I can't look; it's too terrifying." And they're both. It's the same word, that awe, but they're reacting to it with different emotions. Yeah. Not speaking from personal experience or anything. All right, well, let me read 18 forward. Let's see here. So starting with verse 18. Now Abishai, son of Zeruiah, the brother of Joab, was chief of the 30. With his spear he fought against 300 men and killed them, and won a name besides the 3. He was the most renowned of the 30 and became their commander, but he did not attain to the 3. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was a valiant warrior from Kabzeel, a doer of great deeds. He struck down 2 sons of Ariel of Moab. He also went down and killed a lion in a pit on a day when snow had fallen. And he killed an Egyptian, a handsome man. The Egyptian had a spear in his hand, but Benaiah went against him with a staff, snatched the spear out of the Egyptian's hand, and killed him with his own spear. Such were the things Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, did, and won a name beside the 3 warriors. He was renowned among the 30, but he did not attain to the 3, and David put him in charge of his bodyguard. Among the 30 were Asahel, brother of Joab, Elhanan, son of Dodo of Bethlehem, Shammah of Herod, Elika of Herod, Helez the Paltite, Ira, son of Ikesh of Tekoa, Abiezer of Anathoth, Mebunai the Hushatite, Zalman the Ahohite, Maharai of Netopha, Heleb, son of Bana of Netopha, Ittai, son of Ribai of Gibeah of the Benjamites, Benaiah of Pirathon, Hiddai of the torrents of Gosh, Abi Alban the Arbathite, Asmaveth of Bahurim, Eliaba of Shalban, the sons of Jashan, Jonathan, son of Shammah the Herite, Ahiam, son of Sharar the Hararite, Eliphelet, son of Ahasbai of Makkah, Eliam, son of Ahithophel the Gileonite, Hezro of Carmel, Parai the Arbite, Egal, son of Nathan of Zobah, Bani the Gadite, Zelek the Ammonite, Naharai of Beroth, the armor bearer of Joab, son of Zeruiah, Ira the Ithrite, Gareb the Ithrite, Uriah the Hittite, 37 in all.
Yeah, let's talk about Jonathan in there.
Got Jonathan, got Uriah. Last but not least.
Well, on
And,
behalf of all, I was
yep.
just gonna say, on behalf of all the lectors here present, this was left off of election year.
Yeah, this is not an electionary. Surprise, surprise. I want to.
All. Would
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there were 37 people. You know that the verse that we chuckled at, verse 21, he killed an Egyptian, a handsome man, the Egyptian had a spear in his hand. Remember that when we met David, young David, he was described as very handsome and ruddy. And you get this kind of sense that they viewed good looks as an attribute worth being respected. You know, I mean, I guess we kind of do today too, but this was translated into, you know, military might. You know, if you killed a handsome man, you really took out a big figure. You killed Brad Pitt. How dare you? You know.
The Message calls it formidable.
Formidable.
Formidable Egyptian.
Well, and this one says of large stature.
Oh.
This translation.
No.
My translation says spectacular.
Isn't it fun how the translators all they're going to town on this
Of
word?
large stature, formidable.
Spectacular.
I mean, you're lovely.
I mean, it's
David,
probably, they probably read an early translation and said, handsome, that can't be right, you know?
Maybe it's like you're saying Great Britain or England fit, you know?
Fits, right, exactly.
I've got the Children's Living, and another time, armed with a staff, he killed an Egyptian warrior who was armed with a spear. He wrenched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with it. No mention of what the dude looks like.
Yeah, the term in King James Bible is goodly, a goodly person. And what is that word? That's interesting. Mare.
Give me a second here.
Yeah, I think I just got it. Goodly mara means a phenomenon, spectacle, appearance, a vision. Usually attributed to supernatural, which is kind of interesting. So that's why they kind of had a field day with all these translations, because you know, a vision to one person might mean handsome, a vision to another might mean, oh, gargantuan, you know, big fighter.
Or it could be supernaturally handsome.
Or supernaturally, right? Exactly. Yeah. Well, and that leads us to the final chapter, chapter 24.
Just as one thing, Pastor Greg, like you were saying, the Hebrew vocabulary is really limited.
Yes.
So you know, they're all three symbols. They're just a consonant, it's not the vowel, and it's a limited to terse vocabulary. So words have to have a lot of different connotations, more so than English. So
it's like you feed an ancient Hebrew a meal, and they say, you ask, you know, what does it taste like? They'd say good. And you have to kind of figure out, what does that mean? You know, good spicy, good sweet, good right, yeah.
Anyway, sorry. Anyway,
oh, that's a great distinction. Yeah. Would someone like to read 24, maybe verse 1 to 14?
Sure, I will.
Oh, great, thank you.
Okay. The Lord's anger against Israel flared again, and he incited David against the Israelites by prompting him to number Israel and Judah. Accordingly, the king said to Joab and the leaders of the army who were with him, "Tour all the tribes in Israel from Dan to Beersheba and register the people, that I may know their number." But Joab said to the king, "May the Lord your God increase the number of people 100-fold for your royal majesty to see it with his own eyes. But why does it please my lord the king to order a thing of this kind?" The king, however, overruled Joab and the leaders of the army, so they left the king's presence in order to register the people of Israel. Crossing the Jordan, they began near Aroer, south of the city in the Wadi, and went in the direction of Gad toward Jazer. They continued on to Gilead and to the district below Mount Hermon. Then they proceeded to Dan. From there they turned toward Sidon, going to the fortress of Tyre and to all the cities of the Hivites and Canaanites, and ending up at Beersheba in the Negeb of Judah. Thus they toured the whole country, reaching Jerusalem again after 9 months and 20 days. Joab then reported to the king the number of people registered. In Israel, 800,000 men fit for military service. In Judah, 500,000. I'm sorry, how far did you say to read?
To verse 14.
Okay. Afterward, however, David regretted having numbered the people and said to the Lord, "I have sinned grievously in what I have done. But now, Lord, forgive the guilt of your servant, for I have been very foolish." When David rose in the morning, the Lord had spoken to the prophet Gad, David's seer, saying, "Go and say to David, this is what the Lord says. I offer you 3 alternatives. Choose one of them, and I will inflict it on you." Gad then went to David to inform him. He asked, "Do you want a 3 years famine to come upon your land, or to flee from your enemy 3 months while he pursues you, or to have a 3 days pestilence in your land?" Now consider and decide what I must reply to him who sent me. David answered Gad, "I am in very serious difficulty. Let us fall by the hand of God, for he is most merciful, but let me not fall by the hand of man."
Mm.
Okay, that was through 14.
That was perfect. Yep.
Okay. Well, God does sound like an angry parent. You can have your
Yes.
choice, young man.
Wasn't there someplace, somewhere earlier on that God told him that he was not to count the people? At some point, I don't remember. I just thought that was something, or maybe it was in Judges that which we haven't read.
Oh, you might be right. I just don't remember.
That this is definitely a flashback
Yeah.
because Joab's still here. So this is just kind of stuck in.
Yep.
It's interesting to me that it's stuck in here. And also the thing that's interesting to me that, well, there's 2 questions. Why did David's numbering the people anger God? And why did God put on the punishment for David that his people would be punished rather than he would be punished himself? And why was David willing to choose that? So there have been a lot of, I've seen a lot of arguments, discussion, trying to paint David better than, maybe that David didn't choose the fact that he would be on because he thought God might relent and not punish the people. I've seen a lot of stuff. This is really a confusing story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One of my footnotes says, and this is news to me, the final narrative in 2 Samuel, it must be remembered, is part of a larger work with 1 Kings. So even though they were probably on separate scrolls, 1 Kings was intended to be a continuation of this as well. And I just kind of flipped ahead real quick, whether or not we continue reading it, but the David's death does not happen until 1 Kings. I was mistaken. I thought it happened here. But he's preparing for it. So that it says, and the reason this is here not as a conclusion to Second Samuel, but anticipates the building of the temple under King Solomon, David's son. So, you know, it's still on its own, it sticks out as a anomaly for sure.
I'm wondering if when they got all the people together, there was some contagious disease that spread, just because you got a lot of people all in one spot. And then maybe like this could
Deja
be,
vu.
there's going to be, like, you're all going to get sick.
Severe.
Like, don't get everybody together in one spot. If you do, there's a chance lots of people will get sick for the next week or so.
That's what.
Because it's talking about this pestilence as a,
Mhm.
like a ritual
Yeah.
result census. So I'm wondering if there isn't, just like there's some kosher restrictions have to do with food
Yeah.
poisoning.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious if there isn't a practical reason for
Mm.
that, but.
Or
Right.
even Charity, it's an explanation of why there was a pestilence. You know, you know, those things occurred because someone had disobeyed. It was a judgment from God. Yes.
Yep.
Just a thought.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good thought.
And pardon me, when we don't have the scientific answer of why something spread, then God is the simple answer, you know,
Mhm.
think of Greek mythology. I don't know why the sun shines. Oh, because the god carried it over.
Like a chariot.
You know, do we not
Right.
think maybe that's our answer too, right? Like, why did it spread? Because
Right.
God was mad.
Yeah.
Don't do it again.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think,
Or I'll just sacrifice one of you and then he'll be happy.
I
But
think
there
there's,
is-
I'm sorry, go ahead, please finish.
No, but there is history in the Bible. I remember being a kid and my mom was, once we went to public school, my mom was a Sunday school teacher because she was going to know what they were teaching us in that school. She signed up to be our teacher. But I remember her telling us, whether it was in class or just her own personal kids, God had a temper tantrum in the Bible more than once. Look at Noah's Ark. Every single animal, every single person did not sin against God. And we're Irish, so the story of the unicorn, if you don't know that, you should look it up. It's a song, The Unicorn, because there's no more unicorns because you're supposed to get on Noah's Ark and he was frolicking in the mist, and it's actually, it's an Irish song. It's fun.
I know that song well.
My kids all know it well. But did the unicorns in it? He just had a temper tantrum, is how we were taught. Obviously, there's, you know, as you get older, there's more to it, but this is not the only time, you know, God got mad, you did it. He had a temper tantrum. Obviously, as an adult, maybe that's not the best way to explain it, but there are instances in the Bible, we look at him having a temper tantrum. But was it that, or were there flaws? Was there, you know, COVID back in the day? Like, the
Right.
plague would share because we put everybody together.
Mhm.
I think in this period of time, it was pretty much believed that God was the author of both good and bad. And he sent bad things for judgment. He sent good things to reward. That was the way they understood God's to be. And I think maybe through the vision of the New Testament, we can, you know, maybe have a different perspective from a contemporary view. But at that time, that was pretty much, you know, if something bad happened, God was punishing you. And, you know, you had to do what you could to placate God, sacrifices or whatever, that in order to, you know.
Yeah.
And I think no matter who your God was, you know, whether it was, like I said, Greek mythology, or it was, my daughter just read The Lottery in school, which I don't know if you've ever read that. It was a made for TV movie, and I had nightmares for ages from it. But the same story, the town sacrificed somebody, and it was an honor to be sacrificed, but that made the gods happy and the fields plentiful. And that story repeats itself no matter who your God is.
Ah. Fascinating. All
And yeah, I
right.
think you're spot on. Just he does the good and he does the bad because that was our answer,
Right.
not necessarily the fact. It was our answer.
Great.
Exactly. With limited information and, you know,
Right.
background, right. All right, verse 15 to the end. Who would like to do the honors?
Oh, I will.
Oh,
Just
thanks,
pointed.
Charity.
I just got for those at home, I just got volunteered.
Oh, great.
So the Lord set a pestilence on Israel from that morning until the appointed time, and 70,000 of the people died from Dan to Beersheba. But when the angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord relented concerning the evil and said to the angel who was bringing destruction among the people, "It is enough. Now stay your hand." The angel of the Lord was then by the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. When David saw the angel who was destroying the people, he said to the Lord, "I alone have sinned, and I alone have done wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand, I pray, be against me and against my father's house." That day Gad came to David and said to him, "Go up and erect an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." Following Gad's instructions, David went up as the Lord had commanded. When Araunah looked down, he saw the king and his servants coming toward him. And Araunah went out and prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground. Araunah said, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" David said, "To buy the threshing floor from you in order to build an altar to the Lord, so that the plague may be averted from the people." Then Araunah said to David, "Let my lord the king take and offer up what seems good to him. Here are the oxen for the burnt offering, and the threshing sledges, and the yokes of the oxen for the wood. All this, O king, Araunah gives to the king." And Araunah said to the king, "May the Lord your God respond favorably to you." But the king said to Araunah, "No, but I will buy them from you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing." So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. David built there an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being. So the Lord answered his supplication for the land, and the plague was averted from Israel. Maybe the CDC should have tried that.
Good idea.
I think we were all willing to at that point.
Yeah, yeah.
After being on the other, well, not all of us are on the other side, as Greg and Pam are demonstrating this week, but having gone through that, I think we're all willing to burn our yokes if we think it would help.
Definitely. Just drive them over to Atlanta and leave them at the front door.
Instead we sacrificed our senior citizens.
Right. Mm.
But Texas said they were willing to be sacrificed. My father informed me he is not, and we will go get the vaccine. But
Oh my
Texas
good
said they
Lord.
to die for us.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I think to me, it's interesting how this chapter ends with trying to understand a plague, a pestilence. It just seems very current. This idea that kings, human leaders are going to be horribly fallible, even though we all yearn for this sort of strength to represent us. These strong men can be very weak. And also pestilence comes and people don't know how to deal with it. It seems very current.
It's very true. Yeah. And there's that famous book from about 15 years ago called Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is about what the colonists brought to the New World. I think that's what it's about. I haven't read it. Oh yeah, Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, we've got a huge amount of red seaweed, red algae or something about to hit Florida, which could annihilate all kinds of stuff. There's another pestilence.
Right.
No shortage of pestilence.
And now we're parsing out we're trying to do it in a non racist way, or slanderous way to China, that how the coronavirus got started. And I think the latest theory is that it wasn't necessarily the wet markets, just a cross of bat or whatnot, bat soup or something like they were originally saying, but that it was something in a lab and that they were working on a version, like a version of an existing coronavirus they were testing it at a more intense level. And I mean, it's like Stephen King couldn't have written it any better, that it just kind of, you know, human beings, we do this. It's as old as scripture. When they built the Tower of Babel to try to get closer to God, you know, when we try to get a little farther than our, what's the phrase? The reach exceeds our grasp, or vice versa. Our grasp exceeds our reach. No, that's not right. Our reach exceeds our grasp. We
Right.
sometimes kind of fall into folly, and that's kind of what this story is talking about too.
Yes, but our reach in terms of blame also exceeds our grasp, because
Exactly.
what if in fact that is true, and this goes way back right from the very beginning of the epidemic or the pandemic, it was postulated that that's what happened. And I heard a scientist on the TV explaining, well, this is common practice in labs in order to discover how to defeat these viruses. They have to actually work with them.
Right.
Now, if that had happened at Abbott Labs or something in this country, the response would have been very different than the China virus.
Exactly.
You know, it didn't necessarily mean that it was a nefarious thing that was going on, that they were trying to develop a killer virus to unleash on the world, but rather to learn how to kill the virus in the event that it happened.
The key word about what you just said, a scientist
Mhm.
said,
Well, yes.
scientist. And I think
Not a politician.
science, I think, has been missing in part of the blame here. And all the Americans who are blaming wet markets, how many have been to them? I have a girlfriend who taught in China for 4 years, goes to wet markets all the time. I've never been to China, so I'm not even going to speak. But and she said there's good ones in the bad ones. Ever go to a flea market? You know,
Right.
but from what you said, scientist,
Right.
I think has been missing in a lot of what's been repeated.
But the way you said that, that almost makes it sound like science is a bad thing, or
Science was the good thing that's
Right.
been missing in other.
Right. I mean, every medical advance that we have, every technology that we have, it's all because of that scientific kind of inquiry. You can't learn how to battle something unless you're able to at least make a mock-up of it, or a simulated something or other.
And Greg,
yeah.
I totally agree. What I was kind of saying is, in the exploration of science and making advances, we sometimes make mistakes, and that's part of the process. Unfortunately, it can have tragic results. The other one I always think about is the Challenger explosion. Was you know, we were trying to do things at a rapid pace, and we made some mistakes. You know, same with every airplane crash. You know, it's usually human error or human folly, and I think that's just built into the structure of the world, as it were, you know. But you're right, the blame game is not helpful. It's a matter of just acknowledging that God is beyond that, and that, you know, we are a fragile existence for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, you know, science is yet another thing that's been weaponized by the political right. I would like to know, all these anti-science people, how many of them would be willing to not go to the hospital if they were having a heart attack, not take their blood pressure medication, not do this, not do that? You know, it's that kind of cherry picking for the sake of blaming other people, othering other people, you know.
Yeah.
Right.
I think
we find out after the fact that all these politicians that were trying to reap political gold from downplaying COVID and saying that it was fake news and blah, 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 all of them got vaccinated. You know, they were telling people not to do it, and they were doing it themselves nonetheless.
No.
You know.
I have a friend who posted on, well, we were friends, but had posted on Facebook, of course the COVID's getting better. God made our bodies strong and powerful, and I don't know, all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, yes, he did. You are right. And he made your body so powerful, you learn how to give a vaccine. Fantastic. And he made yours so powerful. Oh, you work in a development lab? Fantastic. Like, and he made doctors and nurses, or he gave us free will to then choose to become doctors and nurses and pharmacists. Why do we forget that part?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like we look at, yes, God made my body strong and mighty, but you know what? If I didn't have a surgeon to remove my brain tumor, I wouldn't be here today. No matter how perfect, but he made that body Jewish, might I add, not a Christian, which isn't relevant except that when we look at our God is the only God. And if we don't follow what we want, actually I left a friend of mine's Muslim and she's like, okay, so we're praying for you. I mentioned your name when we were all praying. I'm like, great, let the Muslims. And Trudy's like, can we have the pictures? I'm like, Jewish group.
Yeah. So, friends, we are at the end of this book. So next week we'll start a new one. And let me summarize some options for you. And then we will take a vote. How about that? We can, first logical thing to do, but not saying we have to do logical, is to go right into First Kings and then Second Kings. So that basically is the story of King Solomon and the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, and then the introduction of the prophets, Elijah and Elisha. I think Elisha is in Second Kings. So that's one. So continue with that narrative. If we stay in the Old Testament, some other possibilities of just some with some real meat on the bone would be the book of Job. We've not done that. And then there are, I would suggest one of the two prophets, Isaiah or Jeremiah. If we went to the New Testament, we talked about maybe doing the book of Matthew, Gospel of Matthew, which is our prime book on Sundays this lectionary year. We did that first when I first came here about 5 years ago. So I think the exception of maybe Barb, and maybe, but maybe not Pam, I don't think, but I think Barb and I were probably the only ones there, maybe Mary George for that one. And then if you wanted to do a letter of Paul or just a letter, actually it's a disputed letter of Paul, we could do the book of Ephesians and maybe Colossians together with that. So let me just hear any thoughts or feedback or strong opinions one way or the other.
I think it's Job, unless someone's dying for it, because it's just sort of a downer.
Sounds like a good one. So
I'm needing uplifting.
no, I love eliminating. That's a good one.
Unless someone's like has a burning desire for Job, maybe we can narrow that one down.
Boy,
'Cause that's
I would
just
say
a-
Jeremiah can be a bit of a downer too, so we might want to skip that one. Yeah.
Yeah,
Is
that's a good
Matt-
idea, Charity. That's a good idea.
All right,
Is
so that's good. We've whittled it down.
Is
I
thought
Matthew where there's the Sermon on the Mount?
Matthew is at the Sermon on the Mount. Yes.
I've
Would be
never
nice.
read that, so I'd vote for that.
It would be nice to be studying that as it's going along with our lectionary for the year.
Yeah.
I agree.
Matthew's uplifting.
We get the stories that they never told us in Sunday school.
Okay. I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up at home and everyone in the room. Is Matthew okay?
Yep, for me.
Hey, we don't have to take a vote.
All right, something a little uplifting.
The Gospel according to Matthew will begin next week, and I will not be with you on Sunday. I'm going to be at the Standing Commission of Liturgy and Music, working on our next prayer book, God willing, in Cleveland, and you'll have a guest preacher. It's Alonzo Pruitt, who was here in January for me. He's a lot of fun. So I'll miss you. And I think John is the Gospel on Sunday. So we get a little bit of a breather from Matthew. But what's great is if we start Matthew next week, the very next Sunday is Palm Sunday, and we hear from Matthew on Palm Sunday's account. So that'll be
Great.
perfect.
Great.
Thank you all. It's a great time working on this Old Testament stuff. It's hard. That is for
It
sure.
is.
But it's just going to be nice to hear from Jesus next week. Always nice to hear from Jesus.
Always. Take care, all.
Take care and stay healthy, everyone.
Travel safely.
Take care.
Bye-bye.